I want to welcome you all here today in the room, but also a big shout out to all those who are attending in cyberspace. And what we'll do is we'll make a start right now. Jo, you're, of course, doing it virtually because you've been unwell, and this is an interesting thing, right? So we're trying something new here. So I'll be throwing to you in a bit, but I just wanted to say, my name is Shane McIver. I'm the other part of the collaboration today, representing inclusive education through Deakin Learning Futures. So welcome everybody, and thank you for coming along. And Jo, of course, representing CRADLE. And it was Jo's paper originally around inclusive assessment that gave me the idea of what we could actually do in the space and how we could translate the theory, the big picture theory, into actual practical steps to follow through. So we've got a great stellar lineup for us today too. We've got Juanita and Alex and Mollie, and they'll be presenting for us. No doubt you've read their biographies and the invitation that came out. Very grateful to Juanita talking to us about the good, the bad, the ugly of assessment design and rubrics, and Alex, your approach to quizzes and exams and how you like to paint outside the lines there with your approach, and also Mollie, you're a contributor to the paper and to the book that CRADLE have written subsequent to that too. So we're all interested in those outcomes, your thoughts, inspirations and insights, as well as the students' partnerships in window into that world as well. So Jo, is now a good time to throw it over to you, and let's get the ball rolling because we've got a jam-packed morning.
Yeah, thanks Shane, and thanks for arranging everything and being the person in the room this morning. Apologies, I've had a cold over the weekend, and while I'm mostly better, I didn't want to share it with anyone in the room. So that's why I'm at home today. So I get the honour of kicking off the session. If I make my slides work, I would like to acknowledge country and acknowledge that some of us are virtually attending and others are in the room. I'm here on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that education and learning and inclusion has been something that has been happening here for many, many, many years. And just also to say that we are at a critical point with the voice and for truth-telling and treaty. So my thoughts with everyone, and a special acknowledgement of any Indigenous people who are joining us today. So my job this morning is to really just set the scene before you actually get into the nitty-gritty. And student diversity is increasing in higher education, and there are many ways to think about what we mean by diversity. So student diversity is increasing, and you can see that gold line at the top of the chart is all student numbers. So we're seeing an increase in the number of students in higher education in Australia overall, but you can also see kind of proportionally to that students from different equity groups such as non-English speaking background, women in a non-traditional area, low socioeconomic status, remote and regional students, Indigenous students, students with a disability, all those numbers are also increasing. So even if we think that these numbers are increasing in proportion, we're still overall encountering more people who are diverse within our higher education system in Australia. And while the graph picks out some very particular equity groups of which the Australian government has collected information about for about 30 years now, I think, we can also think about diversity in more than just those groups. We can think about how students might have different futures beyond university, how students might have different learning goals and interests that are motivating them to be at university, in addition to all those background characteristics which are not entirely captured by those few categories on that graph. So while we see this increase in diversity and participation, which is excellent, there are still unequal outcomes that we know that are happening for students. So when I say outcomes, these are student completion numbers on this graph on the screen. And across the top, it's pretty constant that the overall average completion rates are somewhere between 70 and 80%. But in line with that, students from various different backgrounds, and here we only have the information for students from a low socioeconomic status background, remote students, Indigenous students, regional students, and external students who are those studying off campus, we can see that all of those students proportionally complete less, which means that even though we might be seeing increased participation, students are not actually coming out the other end and completing their education successfully in higher education. And our contention is that assessment actually impacts on success. And this makes sense, right? Because you have to participate in assessment and successfully complete your assessments in order to graduate from university. And so that's where what we can do around assessment for inclusion is really important. And for certain groups of students, specifically students with disabilities, there are accommodations and adjustments that we are required to put in place by law. So the Disability Discrimination Act and the relevant act within education require us to make adjustments or accommodations. And at Deakin, our Disability Resource Centre is amazing at doing this. However, we also know from research that adjustments to assessment don't actually completely meet student needs because their needs are perhaps beyond what is a reasonable adjustment, such as extra time. But also we know that there are a whole range of students who don't actually want to say, hey, I'm different, or I have something that might impact my learning. Or they might think, well, I do have something that impacts my learning, but I think it's unfair that I get extra time or different accommodations in assessment. So for a whole range of reasons, adjustments don't actually work for all students. And this is why we have to think about what we're doing in assessment differently, and why CRADLE are advocating for this idea about assessment for inclusion. And the definition is there that assessment should recognise diversity in student learning and endeavour to ensure that no student is discriminated against by virtue of features other than their ability to meet appropriate standards. So here we're talking about focusing on, well, what are the things that we actually want students to be able to demonstrate, rather than the things that might just come along the way, like perhaps handwriting, if the actual thing is about knowledge recall, for example. So I talked already about those specific equity groups and how we should be thinking about diversity more than just perhaps the things that we collect statistics about. And we also need to move away from this deficit discourse where we're saying that there's something wrong with the students. In fact, the problem is probably that there's something not quite right about the assessment, and we actually need to change the assessment design to ensure that all students can demonstrate their capabilities through that assessment. And so if the assessment design isn't very good, problems are likely to be amplified for diverse students. And if we make modifications in taking into account particular specific groups, for example, students with disabilities, for students from a remote area, maybe it's something to do with the internet access that they have, these types of modifications are likely to support many diverse students. And this really aligns with universal design for learning principles, which try and arrange learning in a way that it is accessible to everyone. And so in our recent work, when we were thinking about and trying to find out how we can do inclusive assessment better, there are some important ingredients. Firstly is time and space for discussions to work through the design processes. So like today, hopefully. Having stakeholder representatives present at discussions, and particularly focusing on student voice, but also taking into account everyone who contributes to an assessment process. So it could be learning designers, could be the people running online exams, for instance. And so I know Mollie's going to talk a bit later about student voice and involving students. And also having a safe environment for incremental changes, because it is always this concern that what if we do something that breaks assessment and then it's all terrible. So we need to learn how to do this safely and have those opportunities to make changes in a safe environment. And more practically, what this means is that it's not going to happen at a one-off point. We can't just tick a box on a checklist and say it's done. It's something that's a process that involves many people. And you might have already started to think about the way that inclusive assessment might be addressed at different levels. So at the task design, in what we ask students to do, in the conditions of the task, online, face-to-face, how do we account for different contexts of students, and also the disciplines in which we're assessing. We also need to support staff and student interactions around assessment, and particularly for students who might be feeling like, oh, maybe am I different? Do I want to be different? Do I want to be seen as different? I'd rather just fly under the radar. And also having a policy environment which allows for flexibility. And I guess that's something that we're trying to work on at Deakin. And I do know that inclusive assessment is one of our goals within the learning and teaching plan. So hopefully we're promoting it within at least our own university. So to support all of this, CRADLE have developed a whole range of things, and this inclusive assessment framework and development lifecycle came out of the NESHI project, which I was involved in a couple of years ago. There's two main things that we argue for. One, assessment should credential or develop capability in relation to learning outcomes rather than extraneous attributes, skills, or behaviours. And the second part is that we need to support diverse students to demonstrate their learning. So the first one is about that assessment of learning, perhaps, and this second principle is about assessment for learning. And we argue that this needs to happen in a life cycle. It's not just at one point. So today we might be talking about developing assessment tasks. We might be talking about implementing the assessment. We might be evaluating and reflecting what's already happened. And we also might need to set in place plans for the future for change. And it just keeps on going round and around. And I think another thing that we've come to realize is that even though we might say, make things better for one particular group of students, there'll always be new or different groups of students that we realise that our assessment isn't quite working as well for, that we need to consider in future rounds. So some ways to think about supporting how we do these things around assessment design include the Assessment Design Decisions Framework, which was developed by colleagues, most of whom are at CRADLE, so David Bowd, Margaret Bierman and Philip Dawson. And this takes a broader perspective of what's involved in assessment design. And then also around universal design for learning. And so the three main concepts within that is the multiple means of engagement in terms of learning and activities within the task, multiple means of representation, so that's representing the information in different ways. So this might be options for perception, so visual and auditory, having videos as well as text or spoken things. And finally, the one that's key for assessment is action expression, so how students actually get involved themselves in terms of how they respond to the task. So this could be things like what mode, is it a written, is it an oral, is it something graphic, something creative, also timing, are there choices in even the topic? And so there's a lot of different ways to consider the universal design for learning. And so even adopting one or two of those things can actually make a big difference, we've found. So there's some references. And as Shane mentioned, this is a very brief overview. We have actually published a book around assessment for inclusion, which is open access, which you can just Google and find it online. It's all free to download. And we've also got resources and the NESHI report. So that's a very quick overview. I guess I will stop sharing my screen and Shane will move to start sharing in the room and we'll see if we can unmute the room again. While he's sorting things out within the room, I thought I might remind everyone online that now the room, so yeah, you'll just have to pop up to the back and press that button. Remind everyone online, as well as in person, that we do have opportunities for questions. If you're online, please use the Q&A function and you're also free to chat in the chat. Oh, there we go. Yep, all good. We can hear you.
Magical. It takes a village to
It does.
To pull this together.
And thank you everyone for bearing with us in this hybrid mode.
I have to say too that that link that you put up is a fantastic resource. And for those who are kind of interested in the actual drilling down the nitty-gritty of reviewing their assessment tasks, highly recommended to be able to just spend some time in there and look at the information that's provided. Quite extraordinary, actually. You guys have been working hard. Without any further ado, I'll invite Juanita to the stage. And this is over to you now, Juanita.
Well, thanks, Joanna. Hi. So my name's Juanita. I'm a language and learning advisor here at Deakin with academic and peer support. And today I'm just going to be sort of discussing the trends that we see in study support when students come and bring their assessment issues to us. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the unceded lands and waterways on which we come together. Okay, so I thought I'd start just by giving a bit of context about who uses study support. So we offer services, or a whole variety of services for students and for staff. But today I'm really drawing on the insights that we get from working one-on-one with students. So this is with language and learning advisor appointments and our writing mentor services, which are a peer service where students are trained to assist their peers at drop-ins and via emails. And the data that I'm drawing from, we've got over 5 years worth of where language and learning advisors, LLAs, have documented their interactions with students, and that's about 20,000 student interactions. For the writing mentors, I just have data at the moment for the last 1.5 years, but that's about 2,500 interactions. And I guess there's a word of caution there that this data, is, it does depend on the language and learning advisors and the writing mentors remembering to document the interaction. And also making judgments about, what the students' concerns were that they were bringing to them. But because it is over, a fair amount of time and there is quite a lot of interactions, I'm sort of feel fairly sure that the data that we have is at least in the ballpark. And one of the things that came up was that first year is the most represented cohort of students that we see. However, when I looked into this a little bit closer, what we discovered was that we have first year undergrad, but also first year masters, and it's the first year masters students that actually occupy the largest amount of that group. And so I thought this is quite interesting. So at undergraduate first year, quite a lot of work goes into those units and to supporting students in those units. But also maybe some of those students don't know where we are. We often get those second and third year students who come to see us and they say, oh, I wish I'd known about you guys, a year ago or 2 years ago. Also, second and third year, we do get a lot of students who are coming in as pathway students or RPL who've sort of missed out on that stuff that's embedded in the first year units. And then when we come to the master's students, well, a lot of them perhaps are just returning to study and they've got a lot of anxieties and they want someone that they can debrief with. But also we find that there's a lot of students who are really unfamiliar with the text types that they're being asked to produce. So in their undergraduate degree, whatever they've been doing, maybe they've slightly shifted in their masters, or maybe they haven't done a lot of long form and critical writing in their undergraduate degree. So they're suddenly being asked to produce things like literature reviews, and they just have no idea how to approach them or even what a literature review is. So the issues that they have come to us to talk about, I'll just actually mention the feedback one at the top there. The data there has only just started being collected. That's only 5 months worth of data, and it's only come from the writing mentors. But I thought, wow, for 5 months and only from that's kind of probably pretty significant. So students come to us, they've received some feedback and they say, I don't understand the feedback, or I don't know what to do with this. How can I take this into the future? Other things here that stick out: grammar, time management, EAL is English as additional language, general academic writing, referencing is a huge issue that students come to us with. But understanding the question really, really sticks out there. So that's kind of what I'm going to focus the rest of my presentation today on. And so what we find, students come to us wanting help to understand the question. They're unconfident about how to analyse the requirements and criteria, unfamiliar with the text that they're being asked to create. And they also lack context for making their own evaluative judgment of their work. So they really, sometimes they just want to come to us to talk things through. They might actually even kind of know what the issue is at heart, but they really need to verbalise it. They need that space where they can articulate issues. And so I was thinking about, well, who should be taking responsibility for these issues? And really, I think that we all should be taking responsibility here. And I see that the assessment is sort of envisioned as a shared space where a whole lot of interests intersect. So around this assessment task, we've got the students, we've got the teachers, but there's also policy, there's the learning designers, library and study support. And we're also there looking at different perspectives of this space. Students are definitely engaged in assessments. They've got a lot invested in it. And so it's a spot where learning or additional learning can take place. And I really think that we should be thinking about how we can sort of provide the analogy of preventative care rather than relying on this sort of crisis management approach where students think, oh no, what am I going to do? And then they come and they bombard their tutors or they come to see us. And we have a lot of scope to learn from each other's experiences in this space. So from the study support perspective, so this is drawn from the close work, of course, that we do with students. I want to sort of focus really on about sort of how to make the assessment requirements clear, but also where we can embed developmental opportunities within the assessments for all students. And I'm going to focus on sort of 5 ways that we can support this academic development and to ensure clarity when writing assignments. And I'll just go through and address each one of these. So the first one is lucidity. So making the assignments clear, the requirements and the language that is used. And didn't really want to take sort of like a negative approach here, but I will, just for this one at least, focus on what we see as the problematic assessments that come through. The big one actually is what I would call the over-helpful assignment, where the assignment writer has added so much stuff in there to assist the students to complete the assignments. The students can't find the instructions. They're not even sure what they're supposed to be doing. It lacks focus. The content then becomes quite confusing. It's too long. Often they include like a large, preamble and then sort of tangents that go within the assignment. The next one I call the mashup. It's and this is the assignment that's been around for quite a few years, and over the years, different people have come in, updated things, added their bit here, addressed something else there. And it's kind of moved away from its original purpose. So it's drifted from the original unit learning outcomes, might not match up with the rubric anymore, and it lacks a certain internal logic. And final one really is with proofreading. So you would be amazed at the amount of assessments that come out with incomplete sentences, structure all over the place, referencing styles here, there and everywhere, really poor modelling. So the things that we're expecting our students to create for us, we're not creating for them to look at. And post-assessment, I mentioned before about having feedback that's actionable. So modelling. One thing I think is really important to recognise is that students really do look to teachers for your practices and at the unit material. They value what teachers have to say and their relationship with their teachers. So how you can help students by being a good role model, so making sure the materials are the same standard that you expect from your students, consistent referencing. students will often, although we all have referencing guides available, they'll look into the unit site and see, oh yeah, there's a reference, I'll just follow that model and repeat that. I think it's really important that you provide examples of the text types that you want students to produce. I know people have a lot of different opinions about whether it's good to provide exemplars for students, but in my experience, yes, it is very, very good to provide exemplars for students. And also I think it's important to talk about your own experiences. So I don't mean, run a whole seminar session on, how you might approach an assignment, but even just those little sort of throwaway comments, asides that you might want to make as a teacher. When students come to talk to us, they'll say, oh, but my tutor said this was a good way to do it, or, whatever. That students really respond to what you have to say. The third one is using the unit materials. So it might surprise you that students often think that, or find that sort of the readings, the assessments and the unit content are not connected at all. So they'll come to see us with an assignment problem and we'll say, oh, so have you looked at the unit readings, as where you can start your research? And they'll go, oh yeah, they've got nothing to do with the unit. But you come and think, well, that's probably a little bit surprising. They probably do have something to do with the unit. And what happens often is that in the first week or two, students will be reading they'll do all their reading and they'll come to class and it will never be discussed. And they'll go, oh, well, I've got so much else on, I've got so much else to do, I don't have the time for this. And they'll just think that it's not connected to what they have to do. So I think it's a really important part of supporting students to be able to do their assessments is to bring all those readings and stuff actually into the class. So you can use parts of your readings as exemplars of good academic writing, choose a short passage with some key ideas in it. So this gives you, double time. You get to revisit the ideas in the readings, but you also can have a look at what is good about the text, like its structure, how it uses evidence. That's a really big one, as well as discussing the content that's there. I also think it's really important to require the use of unit text in the assessment, not just so students can come and revisit it and reinforce the unit content, but it does support academic integrity. It provides students with, an example of good scholarship for them to start from. And it ensures that there's going to be content credibility in the student work that they're producing for you. You can have, confidence that it's good sources that they're using. It will also be a source that, as markers, you'll be familiar with. And I think this is going to be increasingly important with the volume of information that is out there now, making judgments about what is good information and also what's happening with generative AI. So you can be assured that you actually know the sources and that students are bringing to their assessments. Okay, rubrics. So we all know that rubrics need to be clear in purpose and in language, and that they should align with the assessment question. And whether we agree with it or not, students will use rubrics as a checklist because they're juggling so much and it's a convenient thing that they can grab onto there at the end. So I think we should also think about the sort of learning opportunities that rubrics can offer students. To achieve this, you can write developmentally focused criteria and use rubrics in class activity. So this helps to establish a shared vocabulary around assessment with students, but this is also a way to help them develop that evaluative judgment that they're often lacking and concerned about when they come to see us. So I've just got a few ideas I'll share with you about how you can use rubrics in class. So if you want to use it to develop student writing, so get one of those exemplars of student writing and get the class to use the rubric to identify, what are the good features in that sample that you're sharing with them. And you can do this sort of at the whole text level for structure, or look at the sentence or the paragraph level to explore, how the evidence that they bring or how clear the writing is. It's also great for developing critical reading. So again, this is another way that you can bring your unit readings into the class. So if you have a section of your readings, you can then get your rubric and get the class to evaluate the reading using the same rubric that they're going to be using for their assessment. And you can discuss how references are used, make judgments about whether arguments are supported, and it just helps to increase awareness of the academic writing style and structure that students are expected to produce. And finally, they're really great in things like group work, peer evaluations, get students together and to actually create their own rubrics. So get them to talk about, well, okay, what would you class as a good performance? And then you can use those rubrics in class to keep their group work on track and to do peer evaluations. And I just thought I'd share just a couple. Okay, so I was worried about my content, so I'm rushing. So in this particular example has come, I think this was from something that was adopted by a school of education. They decided to develop some general course templates for the rubric criteria. And so they've got the space there for like topic and discipline, where the rubric writer can add in that additional information. But I think what is particularly good about this is it focuses on how the depth of knowledge has been achieved for students. So if you compare a rubric like this to an example that just says, that basically just repeats the criteria, demonstrates an adequate depth of content, this gives students a much greater idea of, well, how can I actually demonstrate that depth of content? And so using those sort of by and however statements is really useful for students, and also I'll say very useful for when people come to study support, because we do have a much better idea of what the lecturers and tutors are actually requiring. This one I think is really important, which is decoupling some commonly conflated criteria, and the most important one I see is with referencing. So separating the mechanics of formatting from the higher order skills is something that is not often done in the stuff that we see coming to us. And I think it's probably one of the most important things that we can do in terms of giving students an understanding of what academic work is and why references are so important. Students often feel like references are just there to somehow catch them out or to make sure that they've, consulted something. But it's actually like the basis on what we build our academic knowledge and how our sort of discipline conversations are created. So I think that really needs to be brought out to students. And also I think it's really unfair if we judge students' use of evidence on just the formatting of referencing or those rubrics I see where the highest mark goes to uses 5 references. So, what are those references? Have they been used well and insightfully? So separating it out like this really helps to sort of capture those different elements there. And this one is just an example of it's from a reflective assignment. Again, this is from the same education school, and just showing how you can put these different parts together and make, so you can see that they've added in their own particular things like being linked to the PULP standards. One thing that I did want to mention was here, which I've highlighted down the bottom, is that when students come to see us, when they ask for some insight into the feedback that they've received, it's often not the students who have not done well who are asking us, it's students who have done well. They say, I got this great, accomplished mark here in the reflective commentary, but I don't actually know which bits I did well. So they want to take those good bits that they've done well into their next assignment, but it's not clear to them actually what they've done well. And we often have students come to us who are like, distinction level students who want to take it that bit further want to go into high distinction as well. So it's not always, So finally, consistency. So developing that shared vocabulary around assessment and academic expectations at the unit, course and program level, I think is a really important thing, and something that, teaching staff need to be discussing. Knowing what an essay, report or reflection looks like in your discipline area is really crucial, because they do look different in different discipline areas. I'm remembering a student that came because their assignment instructions were write a report in essay style. And so it's like, well, these are two completely different things. What does this look like? What am I supposed to do here? So if you have a shared vocabulary, understand what you mean, and you all use that in your discipline area, that can be really useful. It's also great if you can recommend resources to students. They'll value what you as their teacher are recommending them. And I'd advise to first look within your own university with the sources that you recommend. For example, referencing guides, they'll all be slightly different at different universities. You might have a favourite guide that you really like how it's formatted and it makes sense to you, and you start recommending that to students. But if it's not from your university, sometimes the details in it are going to be different, so you're going to be putting students at a disadvantage. And if you can have bespoke resources in your unit site, that's really useful for students, because they do really value what's there in the unit site. They don't always go looking around what's outside of it. And to be honest, university websites are incredibly confusing to navigate, and it's really difficult to find information there. We also find, I know with the writing mentors, that data showed that the students who come to writing mentors have mostly been recommended that by their tutors. Okay, so that's it. So thank you for listening to the study support perspective. For those of us here from Deakin, these are the sort of services that study support can offer you as teachers, and I'm sure that every other university also offers similar support for staff as well as students in the study support.
Some better than others. Deakin's right up there.
Okay, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Geez, so many interesting facts in that. I think it was interesting how Jo flagged the fact that there are students falling through the cracks. And through your presentation, Juanita, we've been able to see where that's happening and how. The clarity of assessment, obviously, taking the big chunk there. The data was so interesting on so many levels. And some fantastic insights in and around the rubric too, I must say. And great suggestions. I'm so time poor. It's fantastic to be able to take a bit of this time to reflect on what we could be doing in our own area to stem some of the flow around falling through the cracks. Over to you, Alex. We're going to build further on this. Thank you very much.
Hi there, guys. My name's Alex. I'm a lecturer, unit chair in psychology. I work in first year, and I'm at the pointy end of a lot of these issues. I hear the problems, the huge diversity of students, huge diversity of needs, levels of engagement, disengagement, academic ability, extremely variable, stress levels in students high. The problem for us, though, I mean, because these things I think we can all agree on, the problem for us is the realities of especially, I'm focusing mainly on undergrad, especially first year, but the realities of having massive student numbers. I mean, we've got our typical units are 1,000 students. This is a typical unit, right up till third year actually nowadays. Some units have 2,000 students. That means we've got things like 30, 40 markers for an assessment, and looking at it through that practical lens, and I come at it from a very practical side. I hear about the pedagogy, the principles. As the teacher, or what I hear is we've got to work more work better. And of course that's true, but there's no capacity left because we're relatively understaffed. However, the problems need to be dealt with. They need to be resolved. So that's undeniable. And so I've come at this. And this is my context. I've got first year unit, about 700. I think it's our smallest unit actually. About 700 to 800 students in trimester 1, 200 to 300 in trimester 3. All campuses, dealing with all campuses. I've got about 5 assessments. So I come at this from an extremely practical perspective, and a few of us in the department have come along for the ride. A few of us are trying things, all from using different technology, different approaches, but with some commonalities. So I want to emphasise the commonalities of what we're trying to achieve at a very practical level. Given that we got zillions of students and no spare capacity, how to approach this problem without just going, work more, do it better. We're not stupid, of course we know that. But what can we actually do to address the issue? And what I see as the opportunity for us academics is the inordinate amount of time we spend on busy work. Yeah, to solve the problem of massification of education, which we've just been through over the last 20 years. To solve that problem, we've created these systems and structures and processes that have become their own burden, an impediment to student learning, but also just consuming a lot of our time, a lot of our resources, a lot of academic time and resources, which seem a tad wasteful of what we have to offer. So what we've tried to move towards in some of our units where this is more doable is deconstructing our assessments, focusing less on, I guess, what assessments that have this intuitive appeal, like essays, reports. They're very, they seem very authentic. They're very holistic. They're also very hard to manage. They're very hard to mark. It's very hard to assess what students know and don't know. I know when I transitioned away from open-ended, holistic assessments to what I currently do, I noticed that where students could produce a pretty decent 60, 65 in an essay, if I deconstructed that task and broke it down into smaller components that were more precise, I found that a lot of those students who could score 65 didn't understand even the very basics of what I wanted them to understand. They didn't understand the premise of the question that I thought I was assessing using an essay. And that was a real eye-opener for me. And so part of our motivation has been break down complex, big assessments into smaller assessments, automate as far as we can the marking and feedback provision of those deconstructed assessments, and let go of the busy work, the administration around timelines. Yeah, most of the management of timelines. If you talk to a unit chair, they're not telling you they're exhausted because they have to teach too much. They're not teaching too much. The unit chair's not exhausted even because they're marking too much. They're exhausted because they're managing extension requests, requests for different ways of doing things, answering often trivial questions, busy work, managing 30 markers, sick markers, markers who've taken on way too much work, who then disappear because they don't want to confront the realities of that. That's where the unit chair's effort is often going in our units, especially in a unit with more than 500 enrolments. By automating a lot of our processes. Now, I'll talk about what that means in a minute. It doesn't really matter how you do this, but it's the logic of it. By automating some of the assessments in ways that are essentially cheat proof. So we don't want, just because we automate things, we don't want to allow students to cheat on these things. But in doing that, we can free up things like extensions. We can free up deadlines. Most of the deadlines that exist in our units are not to encourage and develop self-management in students. So those deadlines are because we need to get things marked on time. We need to allocate marking resources, etc., etc. They're not really pedagogic in their nature. I know in some assessments that might be true. We want students to be able to do something quickly and on time because that's professional, but usually it's for us. We need timelines to get the job done. Automating a lot of these tasks means that we don't have to be slaves to that reality, and we can start saying to students, submit the thing when you're ready to submit it, and we'll get it marked that day. Also, in terms of things like feedback, student complaints and student issues, most of those really pertain to I didn't get the mark I wanted, I disagree with the mark. There's an inherent antagonism that we create with our students, where they feel judged, they've been assessed, they perhaps misunderstood our intentions, or even perhaps we didn't express our intentions well enough in terms of what the rubrics were, etc., etc. One approach is to do that better, obviously, right? The other approach is to allow that to be more organic and iterative. So rather than me worrying about what students are thinking and about what I want from them and them understanding what I want and the marker interpreting what I want and applying that, to letting go of that a little bit and allowing it to be iterative. So here's a task, do it when you're ready, here's your feedback, do it again to improve. So we already understand the importance of constructive alignment. Put the marks where you want the students to put their effort. Well, I would suggest we should be allocating marks to things like improvement in learning. So a student receives feedback on an assessment, and currently, typically, the response is, that's not fair, I didn't get the mark I wanted, yeah. Whereas it should be, oh, is that what they wanted? Is that what was expected of me? Okay, here you go, I'll do it again. So iterative feedback, iterative tasks, loose timelines, because we're not tied down to who's marking what when, takes the pressure off us, takes the pressure off students. It allows us to assign harder tasks, because one of the areas of diversity, one of the major areas of diversity in relation to students is just diversity of ability. And so that kind of always, there's a regression to the mean where we tend to create tasks that most students can do most of the time, which isn't fair to the weaker students who find it difficult, but it's also especially not fair to the top students who don't get to excel. And yes, we currently give out HDs, but HDs generally mean you've done this mundane task really well, so you get a HD. That's not what we want. We want aspects of our assessments to be excellent, to be really pushing the limits of what a student can do, and to reward students who can achieve that or approach that point, right? So we want diversity of assessment challenge, which we generally don't have because of this regression to the mean, 1,000 students, lots of markers. It's inevitable that happens. Again, automating some of these things, some of our assessments, to take the pressure off the busy work, allows us to have much harder tasks, more diverse, even easier tasks, but a range of difficulties, allowing students to repeat, improve, do things that, if we only had 10 students, we would do that naturally. If you had 10 students, that's how you would teach them. Here you go, guys, try this. Oh, you could do it? Okay, I'll give you something harder. You couldn't do it? Okay, let's give you something simpler and build your capacity. If we had 10 students, that's what we do. With 1,000 students, we don't do that because we can't. These sorts of things allow us to do that with large numbers of students. So I know I've been talking about this thing hypothetically. Let me show you the sorts of things I mean. So I've got a couple of assignments where the basics of it are exactly the same as any assignment. There's a worksheet that has instructions, examples, resources. Read this. Here are some questions. Answer the questions, and you'll get the following marks. So it might have a rubric attached to it. Everything you'd expect an assignment to have. The second component I include, and that's just a document, a Word document, right? The second component is a personalisation system. And this is, of course, all technologically done, right? So this can get tricky. Interestingly, every single one of us in our school does these things differently. You know, we all approach the problem using the skills that we have. I'm very good with Excel, and I'm very good with Qualtrics because I use it for research. So I utilize those. Other people use Python programming, Visual Basic. I use a bit of Visual Basic to do this as well. This is the personalizer. This allows me to supplement that task. The task is incomplete. The worksheet's incomplete. If, for example, the most mundane example I'll give you, which I think actually works the best, is the one I'll use as this example, and that is, it's a statistical task, but there's no data attached to it. This personalizes the task for each student by giving each student their own data set, which is something in the past that we wouldn't have been possible to do. That's very difficult. Nowadays, it's very simple. So I've got instructions for what to do, and then also each student receives their own data set, their own context, their own numbers, their own problems. Therefore, concerns that automating a process like this would make it cheatable, suddenly those concerns are diminished. I mean, everything can be cheated, but on the other hand, every single student's going to have a different data set or a different task or a different context. So the combinations and permutations that every student encounters means that every student is actually doing a unique assignment, every single one of them. And of course, later, when it's time to mark it, the marking system needs to be able to look at what the student's done and compare it to their personal data and check that what they did was correct, right? And then give them marks and feedback accordingly. So this is a personalising system. The student would get this separately. Here's your data set. That's the easiest way that I can think of doing that, right? So here's your own personal data set. They then go on to whatever system. Yeah, I use Qualtrics to do this. It's like they're like online quizzes. Think online quizzes, and they provide their responses, and then that is marked with my assistance. But a lot of it's automated, and they get personalised feedback that is conditional on the task that they were given, the choices they made, and the data, for example, that they had to work with. So each student has different correct answers, and they get, therefore, very personalised feedback. And they get that the same day that it's submitted. And importantly, they can then redo that for extra marks. I cap, there's no reason you have to do it this way, but I cap the bonus marks that they can achieve to about 60% as a discouragement to just use trial and error. But I mean, you don't have to do that. What that means is that if you don't want a student just, you know, when we have to do our compliance training as academics, what do we all do? Every single one of us, do we read the instructions? Do we learn? None of us do that. Of course we don't do that. We're as lazy as our students. We use trial and error, and we work our way with a bit of guesswork to a pass grade. Well, I try to suppress that a little bit by basically going, look, if you want to get 10 out of 10, then you've got to do that in your first go, right? That's your incentive to give it your best go. But if you don't achieve 10 out of 10, you can still work your way upwards through repeated submissions here. And so they get to, and this is all done with the marking template takes information about them through pipe text. I'll show you what that means in a second. So their name, their student ID, all that information comes through D2L. It combines that with the feedback that's given to them and turns that into an automated email that's sent out to that student. And then when they receive that, they receive it with a different attitude, inevitably. Rather than being told, you're dumb, here's your bad marks, see you later, they're told, here's your performance, here's tons of feedback, because it's automated, you can give them tons and tons of useful feedback, well beyond a rubric, which is a one-size-fits-all kind of feedback. It is, here's how you went, here's what I recommend you look into, given your deficits, and here's your opportunity to revise and resubmit. And that's the key. Rather than looking at it defensively, rather than getting that information from the student's perspective defensively, oh no, I'm not good enough, how dare they? It suddenly becomes, oh, I get it. Okay, I think I can do this task better now. And they give that a go and they try and improve, etc. As many times as they want. They can keep doing this. There are no deadlines other than I tell them on the day of the exam, I will close this unit and bye-bye, it's over at that point. But up until that point, you can revise and resubmit or even submit for the first time right up to the day of the exam. Students obviously love that. It's hugely beneficial from a diversity perspective. People who've got work-life balance issues, they don't have time, they can postpone things, they can submit early and then resubmit a few weeks later, or they can submit and resubmit daily. They can do things when they want rather than when we need them to have it done because of the marking, timelines, etc. Obviously, you can't do this sort of thing for creative work, for very open-ended tasks. We're not talking essays here. We're talking tasks that have right or wrong answers. What we would call in psychology closed questions. They have the question has a definitive answer. It's those kinds of tasks. It's not open-ended. It's not creative tasks. But this is an example of what I meant. This is just a few pages of my worksheet. These are some generic instructions. Dear student, do the following. Here's an example of what you need to do. They would also receive data, personalised data. Each student would have their own data. They would come into D2L and they would click on a link that is personalised for them. That seems very trivial, but it's actually very important. It means I know their ID number, their name without typos. Some people use different names. Some people mistype their ID number. This all comes from D2L itself, so it's all very accurate. There's no room for error. This is one example question in Qualtrics. Like Qualtrics is a survey system. But it's like you could build this in any quiz type system, and their task might be move these, put them in some kind of order, or select things, or click on a document to indicate 3 sentences that are problematic. Or you can use very creative tasks. These are not just multiple choice questions. Not that there's anything wrong. I don't think there's anything wrong with multiple choice questions. They can be very good. But you're not limited to multiple choice questions. I guess is the point I'm making. There are your hot spots to indicate where things are, rank things, select things, move things around, fill in gaps. There's lots of question types that we make use of. This is to give you an idea of what I mean by feedback. This is the minimum amount of feedback that you would get from my assignment task 1. From assignment task 1, this is the minimum. This is a student who got everything right. So I use that as the backbone of the feedback. Every student would get this as a minimum. Then if they get any of the questions wrong, they get extra feedback on top of that. Now that's a ton of feedback. There's lots of information being given there, including tips, pointers, where to get extra resources, and again, very personalised. It will depend. The feedback a student gets obviously depends on what they got wrong and what they got right. And although it's a huge undertaking to build it, once it's built once and connected to all the combinations and permutations of right and wrong answers a student could have given, once you've built it once, it sells itself and works really well. Now, I know this is all really cryptic. I mean, I could give you demos of how this, not literally there because my computer's stuffed at the moment, but it's all just technical. I mean, it's the principle of it. And I think at the heart of it, the principle is automating things to make our lives easier so that we can teach more and better. So it's not just about making our lives easier, it's about paying back by giving students more flexibility and giving them more feedback, more opportunities to revise and resubmit. Like I said, subtle advantages like being able to give tasks that are really stretching their abilities. You normally can't do that. If you give students, if there's an essay topic that most students won't be able to do, how can you assign a topic like that? You get a mutiny, right? It's too hard. But we're meant to be academics. We're meant to be stretching their intellect, challenging them, not just mundane regression to the mean difficulty levels. But because it's iterative, because they can revise and resubmit, we can more comfortably push them into really challenging their abilities, because they can do it again and again and again until they get it. And so we can give more grown-up type of questions where we're not, as you mentioned before, the temptation is to specify everything so much that it becomes like a legal document. And the thing is, again, we're not stupid. We do that because we've got 1,000 students. And if you don't give students every bit of information, you'll get 50 emails going, well, what do you mean by this? What about this? Could I do this instead? So the natural response to that is more. Because students can't afford to get it wrong. We can't afford to have 100 emails asking for more clarification. So we always overcompensate and produce things that we can tell are not good, but are kind of inevitable because of how the system's built. Mass education that we just can't handle very well. So this kind of liberates us a little bit, these sorts of approaches. So a lot of our units are now moving towards 1 or 2 assessments that are automated where possible, where it's not necessary to have a holistic assessment that must be marked by a marker with a rubric. So that's what we're moving towards. And it's so it's something we're trialing. I've been doing this since 2017, I think. I haven't looked back. I've not had one complaint from a student about it. I mean, I've had complaints from students, but not about the process and how I do it and the feedback that they get. They love it. They love that. So I would encourage staff to give these sorts of things a go.
Round of applause. Thank you so much. I can smell the rubber burning. A lot of people thinking about putting it through our own filter and thinking, how can we make things work for us, and how can they be made to be simpler? And just
so Shane, a few words while Mollie's coming up. I just wanted to feedback some of the things going on in the chat online. Everyone's really excited about the different approaches and some really interesting thoughts around what we're assessing, validity, the tension between rewarding effort and punishing those who need to do things outside of work, outside of study, what students do with feedback. If they interesting, Alex, that your students love your feedback, because I think not all students are interested in reading the feedback. But I can see Mollie up there now, so I'll stop.
They are the challenges of our time, are they not? Mollie, over to you.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming today, and hi to everyone online as well. I'm worried I'll be a little bit repetitive, but hopefully I'll take a fresh take on all of this. And so today I'm going to be talking about inclusion. I'm not just going to be talking about inclusion in assessment, because of course we know that our entire learning experience all sort of interweaves with one another as well. I'm sure you're all hearing lots of things today as well. So just remember that when it comes to this inclusion stuff, it is a marathon and not a sprint. So don't be too overwhelmed. So I suppose in an ideal learning experience, this is what your classroom should look like, right? It's filled with different people, different backgrounds, and so on. And as Joe's saying, you know, they come to our education systems full of different aspirations and learning preferences and learning experiences and so on.
Mollie, you might want to prompt Joe that you're on camera, Joe.
Okay. And as Joe was mentioning, to this end, we often use equity categorizations. Things like students with disabilities or students from low socioeconomic backgrounds regional students, and so on. And these categories, and maybe you use them in your own research or your own practice as well, they can be really helpful. They can be helpful because we can have better discussions with each other about what do you do with regional students, or what do you do with First Nation students to make sure they feel supported. They're also useful for benchmarking, for funding, for evaluating, and all these other things. But these labels are also incredibly dangerous, because even as teachers with the best intentions, we lead ourselves into bias and stereotyping with these labels. And they make us assume, oh, I've had a student like this before, so this is the support they're going to want. Or who will need help, who won't need help, what kind of help they will need. So if there's one takeaway from this presentation today, I would like you on a practice level, maybe not in research, but at least on a practice level, to not use these labels in these conversations you have with your peers, and instead try to move away from labels to descriptors to help us humanize the process of teaching these equity students. Because when we do this, we can have more rich conversations about why a student might lack social support. Yes, it might be because they're first in family, or it might be something else. A student might be using text-to-speech software because they have a disability, or they might have something else going on where that's just their preference in learning. So we just need to think about these things with a bit more of a human touch. And just like our students, or just like, yeah, we too are also complicated. And so the same way we wouldn't want to be labeled, we should also think about not wanting to label them and to challenge our assumptions. So today I want to talk about inclusive classrooms or inclusive assessment through a model of disability. Now, some of you might be familiar with this, the biopsychosocial model of disability. Often it's called the social model, but increasingly we start to recognize other factors as well. And what it is it moves away from the medical model of disability, where a disability is seen as an inherent deficiency within the person, to instead thinking about the confluence of factors that lead someone to disadvantage. So those can be biological, they can be psychological, or they can be social as well. And what's really key when you think about things in a biopsychosocial model is it's about shifting the responsibility. And Juanita talked about this as well, to not just the student to navigate, to have confidence, to figure out our educational systems, but to think about how we are going to also play our role in making sure our systems are equitable and inclusive as well. So that's really important here. And so while this is typically used in disability, I want to use it today for our conversation to talk about inclusion in general, and something perhaps you can take away with you when you're thinking about it, to use these three factors to think about how you are providing inclusion in your teaching spaces. All right, so to get started, let's talk about biological inclusion. These are things like physicalness and gender and so on. So the questions here to consider are, how can diverse students participate, both access and participate in your unit, and what should be considered in the physical spaces and online? In a research project I'm working on at the moment, a really good vignette sort of this story is a student who had hearing impairments. And they had a teacher and they had asked them to speak up. Can you please speak up in the tutorials? Yes, I use the transcription, but it doesn't work very well. Can you simply speak louder? And the teacher really struggled with this. We also spoke to them about, because they're not a loudspeaker. They're not like me. They're a soft speaker. So it's a really interesting space. Sometimes the biological space gets written off as, okay, I'm going to use UDL principles, or I'm going to make sure, everything's accessible as far as the software. But it's more complicated than that. It's more nuanced than that, because we still have our preferences. We have our way of doing things as people, as teachers. They have theirs. And also what works for one student, as you were saying, doesn't always work for another student too. So it's not as easy to just say, we're just going to do it this way. There is no perfectly designed, equitable learning environment. These things have to be discussed through conversation and through relationships and so on. Now, in this space, I put a picture here of a reflection, because biological inclusion really in particular lends itself so well to teacher reflection. And I highly recommend, we have Barbie Panther here for you, those of you that are at Deakin, where there's peer-to-peer reflection activities happening here at the university, if you have that at your university as well. But another great tool for this is student personas. So looking online or developing your own for your cohort of personas of students who might be facing challenges, again, trying not to use those equity categories, but might be facing challenges in their learning experience, and going through your unit and thinking about what it must be like to experience your unit if you were that student. Another option for you, especially if you're here at Deakin, because we have the support to do so, is our Students Mentoring Staff Program, where students can literally user test your unit for you and talk about the different ways that perhaps inclusion could be improved. From research, there's also lots of commonly identified barriers in this space as well. Things like access to campus and classrooms. A lot of times we make assumptions about why students aren't showing up to our class, but there's lots of reasons for that. Maybe the parking often fills up. Maybe they have a walking or a physical disability that makes it difficult. Therefore, they don't come to campus. Inaccessible LMS sites, lighting, seating, sound, all of these things. And really important here, and Alex touched on this, is the flexibility of the due dates as well. So this comes up time and time again in with research with colleagues, and I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about it as well. So some of you may perhaps be familiar with this increasingly commonly discussed concept called CRIP time. I'm working on a special issue at the moment, and we have 2 students who are writing about it and what it's like to experience CRIP time. But essentially, it's this idea of recognizing that people experience time differently. And that might be mediated on their health. It might be mediated on lots of different factors, right? People with chronic medical conditions, just as an example, have flare-ups. They have good days, they have bad days, and so on. So one of the things you might want to check yourself when you're doing your reflection in the biological sphere is to think about, do you do things like, I'll post assessment 2 information later because I want them to focus on assessment 1. That's you putting your idea of how someone should go through your unit, right? You don't want to do that. You don't want to assume that people experience time the same way that you do. So another thing, students who attend tutorials will get a live walkthrough of the rubric as a bonus, but I'm not going to do this as a video because I want to reward the students who have attended the tutorial or who have attended the lecture. I understand the inclination to do this, and in my previous teaching days, I did this too. But I don't do this anymore, and it's really important to think about how we are creating equitable learning spaces and not forcing students to fit our preconceived notions of what an ideal or what a good student should do. And one of the things we hear about sometimes in the research is we hear teachers say, well, they're going to have to do this when they go to work. So I'm just preparing them for the hard challenges they're going to face at work. That's not our role. And actually, quite the opposite. Our educational systems should be thinking more future focused than that. We should be thinking about how we want to create the next generation of managers and leaders who will create more inclusive workplaces as well. So a little bit just really quickly on CRIP time as well. There's this wonderful exhibition that was this year at the Boston Museum of Fine Art by a rising artist. The point here being is that when we make things exclusionary, when we are reactive rather than proactive, the result of that is that people feel like they don't belong. Do you want me here or not? Why is it always my responsibility to ask you to turn on the transcription or to ask you to do this in your unit? Why can't we be more proactive and make them feel welcomed? Okay, next sphere. So we've talked about biological. Now on to psychological. So these are things like psychological safety, things that span mental health, emotions. Now, of course, all of this weaves in and out as well, but just as a framework to help guide your thinking. So learning, as we know it, for all of history, has been a relationship mediated on power imbalances. The teacher, the student, right? The teacher has the power and the students don't. And this has an incredibly long-term effect on students. And for some students who perhaps have performed well in education systems for whatever reason, don't make assumptions there, then fine, maybe they're okay with that. Maybe they've learned to accept it. But for other students, you can think about the cumulative effect that that would have on you, where you feel like you are powerless, that someone is deciding whether you are smart, whether you are worthy, whether you know something or not. And this has, in particular for equity students, serious consequences where, again, they don't feel like they belong, they don't feel like they matter, and they don't even feel like you'll notice or that you will trust them or that you think anything of them, potentially not you as a teacher, but just because that's the way they've been doctrined into our education systems. So, in one unit, we are not going to be able to correct the entire, imbalances of the entire educational system, but you can think about how you break down those walls, how you think about whether the information is clear. Do you provide examples? When I say, are you on their level, that's because students in our research have often talked about this, where some teachers come in and they want to, if anything, embrace that power imbalance. I am the teacher, you are the student. This, that's not how we want to be inclusive and equitable in our classrooms. And in the same argument, if you're talking about preparing people for work, I also think that the workplace is changing when it comes to those power imbalances as well. So it's much better to treat our students, especially we're all university teachers, as future colleagues. Treat them with respect. Think about how you're breaking down those power imbalances. Intertwined with this, of course, is disclosure. So Joe talked a little bit about disclosure. We have no idea how many students actually have disabilities or not. It's something around 13% last time I checked at Deakin, but we also know from research that huge numbers of students do not disclose. So, I'm not going to try to put a number on it, but we should also try to think about disclosure, not just in the realm of disability, but also thinking about them as a person, about what they might be going through. I had a student a couple of years ago who messaged me, and their husband had left them, right? And they go, what do I do for an extension? How do I evidence that my husband has left me? And I just thought to myself, oh my God, imagine going through one of the worst moments of your life, and you have to not only disclose that to a teacher who you might not be comfortable with, but then you have to beg them for an extension. How dehumanizing is that? So thinking about that in your unit, thinking about how you can provide students with the respect that, okay, if you need more time, I can trust that there's a reason that you need more time, and not put them through these processes that dehumanize them. So creating positive learning environments where students know they can disclose to you, maybe they want to disclose, but maybe they don't, and curate spaces free of judgment, stigma, and discrimination. So some of the tips you can do to fostering these PLEs is making sure the students know it's always okay to ask, the numerous communication channels. Some students may want a one-on-one, a phone call with you. Some may want email, be open to different things. Reducing assessment pressure, we talked about that today, and alternate assessment formats, letting students play to their strengths. Failing is learning, and rewarding students for trying again rather than failing in the first place. And just remembering that assessment and learning, being judged, being evaluated, is emotional. It is an emotional process. The path forward is not to standardize this to a point where it doesn't matter what their emotions are or what your emotions are. It's to embrace and to understand that it is an emotional process. And then finally, we have social inclusion. So just like us, students have their own, support or lack thereof of their peers, of their relationships, but it also relates to societal acceptance on a whole, our social cultural norms and so on. So one thing here to remember is to think about students' identities and what you're doing to foster a positive identity for them. Because it's important to keep in mind that while identities are personally held, they are socially constructed. We have an impact on their identity. So thinking about how your unit or how your teaching experiences can help build their confidence, strengthen their social ties and networks. Are you creating lots of opportunities for them to make friends in your unit? Are you encouraging them to, meet up with one another, doing the best that you can to scaffold that for them? Are you showing empathy and connection in your own experiences with them, but also challenging discriminatory norms or practices in the potential professions? Because it's at university where they really start to think about what kind of worker am I going to be? What kind of career am I going to have? And thinking about, as much as possible, opening those up to them. And again, being the model of what you would want an inclusive workplace to be, in the hopes that we are creating the next generation of a more inclusive workforce. So just to highlight a bit of research that I did last year, we worked with students with disabilities who were doing work integrated learning placements. And these are really important, of course, of all the activities in university that are going to build a student's professional identity. You can imagine a work learning placement is going to be a big one. And what they found is that they were often stigmatized in these, that when they disclosed or when they didn't disclose, but somehow the topic of disability came up, they could hear the managers, feeling tension there, or I don't know how I would work with someone like that, or things like that. So we can't control that. That's out there in the industry, though I would argue that maybe we could do a bit more training with our industry partners. But anyway, but it's our role as teachers to prepare them for those conversations, to understand that they might face those things. And how are we going to build their confidence up and help them feel included in our educational spaces, to feel like they can be able to tackle those or to go on to those, and to know that there's nothing that they've done wrong if they do encounter that. So building a social inclusion in your unit, thinking about how you welcome students, how you make sure that they are now part of your community for a trimester or a semester, and how you're going to build that up, fostering connections between peers, so important. And also thinking about, with your choice of curriculum, how is your curriculum challenging stigmas or injustices in our social world? Do you have good representation of researchers and academics and readings and so on? But also how are they? This is something almost a zeitgeist, if you will, especially with the younger generations coming into our classrooms. They want content that is imagining the world better than it is now, for good reason. Okay, so this is all a lot, and I've tried to keep it short, but sorry. If you are at Deakin, please check out our fabulous Deakin Students as Partners program. We have, as I mentioned, the Students Mentoring Staff program. We have Teaching Students as Partners grants, and there's also a co-designed community of practice, and we have personas for equity students that you can use in your classrooms as well. And I just want to end really quickly with, it's okay to feel all of these things when it comes to providing inclusion. But believe it or not, this was not a word cloud created by academics. It was created by students in our study, talking about how they feel about in their teaching and learning experiences as well. So my point being is we all feel anxious and stressed, and we're all a little bit unsure where to go. So, okay, that's it for me. Hopefully I didn't take up too much time, Shane.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Particularly like your points around social inclusion, actually, because there's always a price to pay when you don't feel seen and you don't feel heard. So now I know we want to get to questions. Before we do, though, I would just like to flag, obviously the conversation doesn't stop here, and that there are places to go and for us to kind of keep having them. And that is, I'm encouraging you to join our new Inclusive Education Community of Practice team site. And I'm going to do, it's going to be a bit of an opt-out. Everyone who's registered for the event will be included, and then it's easy to withdraw if you need to. Hopefully you'll keep the conversation and keep in the loop for upcoming events, keep the conversations flowing. There's an email, but there's a website too with tons of resources for you to look at as well. And further to that, this is mainly for our online cohort, because I know that you might be making moves towards lunch, etc. Rightly so. We'll be doing this activity in the room after the questions. But I just wanted to flag this. If you've got the QR code there for you on the screen, you can just scan it with your phone and it'll take you straight through to the survey. There's really only 3 questions. And I would like to kind of capture 3 elements. The wow, what has been the singular take-home message or light bulb moment that's gone off for you in this process? Well, all the things that we've talked about today, we've talked about a lot. We've covered a lot. What's the one thing that kind of jumps out at you? The now, if you would change one thing in your approach moving forward, what would that one thing be? And then the third question is the chow. If you were to drop something from a habitual approach, what would you be dropping? I would say in my case, it'd be drop the habit of leaving things to the last moment, right? But we've all got something that we think, you know what, maybe I need to rethink my approach and then do a little bit differently. So I'll keep those up there, and the QR code for people to kind of catch up with the online provision of the answers to those questions, because we're really interested in what you think about that. And in the process, we can throw it open to questions. And I think, Joe, you might have the lion's share perhaps from the online group.
Yeah, Shane, thanks. The first question is, can we get a link posted to the survey? I can't make it work for some bizarre reason.
The link is there, but it's extraordinarily long and complicated. But the QR code should actually work. I did it. Worked on my computer, so
I'm having trouble. I don't know if you're able to maybe log in and sort it out. Well, I can ask some questions to the panel first, perhaps. And I think the first question, which is
Mollie, do you want to sit here, and we'll have to share the mic.
Sorry. So should I? So the first question, which I think might have been around when Juanita was talking, but I think actually perhaps everyone might be able to respond to it. How can we find the balance between supporting students? For example, they might have anxiety, but also challenging them to grow and learn. For example, developing their public speaking skills. So thanks, Rosie McIver, for that question. Don't know who wants to respond.
Yeah, well, great question. I think we all grapple with that all the time, and my kind of weak response to that is to keep doing and keep trying different things. But I do think it's incredibly important that we do challenge students and that we set challenges for students. So often I know in study support there's kind of a view that everything should be helped, and this idea that everything should suddenly be made easy. And I don't think that is what we should be doing at universities at all. We should be setting challenges, but we should be stepping them in ways that are being described to make them achievable, but still, recognise that we're grappling with difficulties. And I think it's really important that we share with students that we grapple with those difficulties as well, And so sharing our processes with students is something that I think is incredibly important for learning. I
would obviously agree. I mean, I think university is a place to be stressed and anxious and even frustrated, for going by the words that the students wrote on that cloud thing. University, there's nothing wrong with stress and anxiety and even frustrations. That's how you build psychological grit. University should be a safe place where those things are felt. That's the difference, right? They're not places to avoid feeling stress. They're the places to avoid feeling distressed, because you should be supported as you deal with difficult problems, difficult challenges, negative feedback, demands that are difficult to achieve. Otherwise, you won't develop or even know your limits. You won't even develop that. So university shouldn't be easy, but it should be safe. That's the way I would describe that.
Talk about safe spaces, but there's an interesting idea about creating brave spaces too, isn't there? Any other questions?
There are heaps online, but I wondered if anyone in the room might want the opportunity to ask a question.
I'm asking it to the world.
Yeah.
Any questions? No, everyone's okay here. Keep it coming.
Okay, so here's one from Phil Dawson.
Go ahead.
Wealth and income inequality is being exacerbated by the rise of generative AI. If you have money, you can get better, faster, and more reliable AI help. Assuming we don't want to and probably can't ban AI, what would you suggest for inclusion as we move into a world where artificial intelligence is highly prevalent?
You've got some thoughts on that, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, obviously AI is going to be. Oh, hang on, I got something. It's on. Yeah, obviously AI is going to be, greatly utilised in future. I already put all my assessments through AI to see what it comes up with, and it comes up with some excellent answers. Particularly, what I love about AI is it really challenges that notion that academics have held on to for so long, that tasks like essays are somehow impervious to being cheated, whereas multiple choice questions are so easy to cheat. I love that AI has revealed the emperor's clothes there. But I think to respond to your question, we need to help students learn how to use AI effectively. Yeah, there shouldn't be barriers in using it. it's going to be the default. It's like Google. You know, people are going to go to Google as their first port of call when they've got a question that they want to answer. So we should be helping students use that. I mean, I helped a student, not a Deakin student, but an ex-Deakin student who was doing their masters at another university. And in helping them, they had a statistical issue. I realised that they had hired a professional writer for their masters, a professional statistician for the results section of their masters, and they were getting help from me as well, as somebody who was just helpful, I guess. And I saw that, and it is quite a wealthy student, I should add as well. But I really, it was a real eye opener, and I thought this student has really outsourced their entire master's thesis, and they haven't even discovered AI yet. I think when they discover AI, they'll throw a bit of a party. So yeah, it is a problem. It's a worry, but it can't be avoided, and so we should be helping students. We should be teaching how to use these sorts of resources.
Yeah, I just want to touch quickly on what Alex said, which is, Phil, I had the same reaction to your question, which is inequities in our educational systems have always occurred, regardless of whether AI happened or not. There was money for mentors. I don't know about hiring people to. That sounds maybe
to write.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like that's your but yeah, I mean, always, and you know, there's the famous case that, you know, for anyone who's Chinese listening, I think Xi Jinping has a doctorate from Tsinghua University. There's no evidence he actually ever was at Tsinghua University, because I'm sure somebody submitted that for him. So the idea is that instead, I think we have to get away from trying to outsmart them, so to speak, because I don't think we're going to do that. And thinking about how to create units and learning that people want to engage in, that they see how it will benefit them and they want to learn it or understand it, and stop trying to chase this this fruitless and hopeless task of making it more forced, catching them. I don't know, Juanita, if you had something.
Maybe slightly tangential, but just thinking about the points that are raised with students going to AI, especially the state of it at the moment, just brings me back to thinking about how important it is that we're teaching students evaluative judgment, and that they bring their own evaluative judgment to things, so that, you know, they can be sure that the information that they're using, and we can be sure that that information there is something that is solid and real and is valued by the discipline community that they're working in. And to me, that's probably the greatest challenge that we're looking at the moment.
Probably have time for one more, Jo.
Oh, going to make me choose. There's so many. There's 5 questions left. I'll try and sort of combine a few. I think that there's some people wondering, Martin McMurrow and also an anonymous attendee, around this sort of removing deadlines. So how does that work for things like group assessments? Like, obviously it needs to be coordinated amongst the group, but also if you remove the deadlines, do some students just end up putting it right to the end of the term, and therefore it adds to stress rather than reduces stress? So I guess, you know, what are the practicalities? Maybe Alex might have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, this isn't a one size fits all. Some assessments, like group assessments, it has to be structured, and in fact you'd want to teach students that reality, that does need to be coordinated in time and place, and that's a skill set. But the point I made was, most of the timelines that we impose have nothing to do with learning. They're to do with us. They suit us. They're not. So I've got nothing wrong with time and structure and teaching those things, but I don't want us to be penalising students because they can't meet deadlines that exist so that we can get our job done. That, I think, is the problem. And I would say 90+% of timelines exist for nothing other than our business needs. So that's how I would respond. So it's not a one size fits all. Some assessments, no, you wouldn't want to do that. But for some assessments you can and should, and it just gives students more wiggle room. But so students, yes, there's the risk that a student will delay and delay and delay, and some do. But most of them will just, it gives them some degrees of freedom so that they can postpone mine, so that they can deal with that group task that has to be done on Monday afternoon. They can postpone mine if they want. And it basically gives more freedom to the students. They can do what they want. They learn more independence, perhaps, in doing that.
So many requests are based on the fact that everything's due at the same weight, right?
So
there's a multi-headed hydra going on there. I'd like to thank everybody for coming along today. I will solve the Qualtrics story through the team site, and I'll send the link in to make sure it's all working all fine and dandy.
Yeah,
I want to
thanks.
thank everybody for coming along. Mystery solved. I want to thank everybody for coming along in cyberspace as well as in person. Thank you very much for that, and let's hope we can keep the conversation rolling. Thank you very much, everybody.